Welcome back, everyone. I'm Yossi Goslin, NBA salary cap expert, and I haven't talked about the Klay Thompson trade yet. I want to get into that, talk about how it helps improve the Mavs, and I also want to talk about how it impacts Warriors. Even if he's not quite the player he used to be, this is a pretty big trade for both teams. So I want to get into that and also talk about their both teams' overall offseason. And if you're new to the channel or been here already, please like and subscribe if you haven't. It'll help a lot with the channel's growth. And yeah, let's get into it. So I want to start with the Mavs side of things because the Klay Thompson signing, him leaving the Warriors, was pretty unexpected until we got very close to the start of free agency. So as far as what the Mavs offseason was concerned, at a minimum, it was expected that they were going to do what they can to re-sign Derrick Jones Jr. He had a breakout year and just played extremely well, was really valuable part of their rotation. They probably wouldn't have made the finals without him. But they didn't have sufficient bird rights to resign him because they only gave him a 1 year minimum. So they were going to have to use the full non-taxpayer mid-level exception, or at least a big part of it. And they didn't have access to it because their payroll was so high. So if we look at where they were coming into the offseason, they were right below that first apron, that $178.1 million amount. If you're going to use a big portion of your mid-level exception, you're going to be hard capped to that. So they were going to need to save some money just to unlock it. And Nico Harrison was even saying ahead of free agency that re-signing Derrick Jones Jr. was their plan A and plan B. And as you can see, they only had the taxpayer mid-level at $5.2 million just based on where things were at. So they were going to need to save some money in order to unlock the full exception. So to save money, the Mavericks went ahead and traded Tim Hardaway Jr. to Detroit Pistons. The Pistons had a lot of cap space, and that was one of the biggest salary dumps of the entire offseason. Kind of surprised of how little cap space went into salary dumps. Really just the Pistons did that, and then the Hornets did a couple things. But they absorbed Tim Hardaway Jr., and they sent the Mavericks back Quentin Grimes, and the Mavericks only had to send out 3 second-round picks to make it happen. I came up with a very similar trade in my Pistons video, except I had the Mavericks trading a first, so much better for the Mavericks. So they save a lot of money, and they get a good, cheap rotational guard in Quentin Grimes. He's on the last year of his rookie deals, and they'll be able to extend him during the offseason. So then they open up the full mid-level exception. However, they don't bring back Derrick Jones Jr. They went ahead and signed Najee Marshall. And there was some reporting heading into free agency about how Derrick Jones Jr. switched agents. And I didn't even know that this was a rule, but apparently if you do switch agents, there's like a 15-day grace period. You have to wait until the new agent and the player could technically start negotiating. So I don't know. I could be getting the information wrong. It was a while ago, but that seemed to complicate things for the Mavs. So it sounds like they just decided, listen, we're not going to wait 10 days or whatever it is since the start of free agency to figure stuff out. We're going to move on. And they got Najee Marshall. And he ended up getting less than what Derrick Jones Jr. ended up getting with the Clippers. So that's pretty good. They get a little discount there. And then as far as Klay Thompson, that was up next. That move was coming up. And when we look at what the Mavs had, okay, so now they used a big portion of their mid-level exception, and they created this trade exception by trading Tim Hardaway, $16.2 million. So logically, the idea was that they were going to sign and trade for Klay. He would go into that amount, and the contract he ended up getting, basically the first year salary would fit into that. And Quentin Grimes went into the remainder of this other trade exception that they had when they traded Davis Bertans. So they had the full $16 million amount. However, as you can see here, they are still very close to the first apron, which are now hard capped to after signing Najee Marshall. So even though they could technically fit Klay Thompson into this trade exception, they still need to save more money in order to also pay Klay and stay under the first apron, that $178 million amount. And that basically meant that Josh Green or Maxi Kleber, one of those two, were going to get traded so they could replace their salary slots with Klay Thompson's. And given that Quentin Grimes came in, that made Josh Green a whole lot more expendable. The Mavs agreed to sign Klay Thompson for 3 years, $50 million, but they were going to need to sign and trade for him. and they sent out Josh Green in a 3-team deal that eventually became 6-team deals, but they sent him to the Hornets. And so Josh Green had a $12 million or so salary. So they can take back technically up to like almost $8 million for him. So that's more than enough to cover Klay's first year salary. That's just under 16 million. So Josh Green for Klay Thompson works on the Mavs end. And now they could go into the season with this roster. There are 14 players, which is the minimum required, and they are slightly into the luxury tax, so they could potentially get below it later if needed, but they are right at that $178 million first apron, so they can't really spend that much more money. The only other move I could see happening right now, well, just one that I would expect, is that they signed their second round pick, Melvin Ajinça. They could still sign him to a contract that would still fit within that hard cap that they have right now. And because they ended up trading Josh Green for Klay Thompson, they still have that Tim Hardaway Jr. trade exception. So they still have that, but they're not going to really be able to use it this season. It'll expire on July 6th of next year. So they have like a pretty small window realistically to use it next off season. But just so you know, they still have that exception. Klay didn't actually end up going into it. So out goes Tim Hardaway Jr., Josh Green, and Derrick Jones Jr. In comes Klay Thompson, Quentin Grimes, and Najee Marshall. So there's like people are kind of going player for player comparisons. Quentin Grimes versus Josh Green. I think I'd rather have Quentin Grimes, especially offensively, and he's much cheaper just for this year. If they can extend him at something lower than what Josh Green's going to get paid over the next few years, then that's an absolute great swap. Najee Marshall versus Derrick Jones Jr. I think what Derrick Jones Jr. just did for the Mavs, I wouldn't expect Najee Marshall to repeat those highs, but I think he has a safer floor. I think he's a little more skilled offensively. Might not have quite the defensive versatility that Derrick Jones Jr. just brought, but I'm also a little skeptical that whatever Derrick Jones Jr. just did, he might not be able to repeat that. It took him a while to really become a good rotation player, and he found that role with the Mavs. I like the Najee Marshall signing, especially because he came in a little cheaper as well. Klay Thompson versus Tim Hardaway Jr., I think that's pretty obvious. But you might be thinking, well, we just saw what Klay did with the Warriors. He struggled these past 2 years. Why should you feel any better about him being a Mav? And, well, he's going to play next to Luka, and Kyrie's got two high-level playmakers. I think this is one of the best places he could have gone to really get set up well to thrive. And the only other team I could really think of is maybe if he went to Indiana, played with Tyrese Halliburton, he would have gotten a lot of great looks too. But this is probably as great as an opportunity he can have to reinvent himself as a high-end role player that can hit threes at a high level again. So I feel like if this is probably one of the best places for him to succeed going forward. So I like it for the Mavs. Now let's look at the Warrior side of things. And heading into the offseason, they were kind of in a holding pattern to try to figure out what to do with Chris Paul's contract. He had that $30 million salary that was non-guaranteed, but they had until the start of free agency to either guarantee him or just cut him and not be on the hook for anything. And there were discussions that they were talking to the Clippers about trading for Paul George, which would have involved this contract, probably Andrew Wiggins as well, and maybe some young guys and picks to satisfy him, but it didn't end up working out. And after that, they were going to go ahead and cut him. Other moves that they did was that Gary Payton Jr. picked up his player option. They guaranteed Kevon Looney's $8 million salary. And on draft night, they traded for Lindy Waters III. And as far as their financial situation goes, they were slightly into the tax. They just spent a ton of money over the past decade, and I think the expectation is they're either going to tamp down on that spending, unless they could get a star like Paul George. Then that would give them a pretty high payment, and that's probably the only type of situation that they would have been willing to spend a lot again. And had they gone down this path, they would have only been limited to the taxpayer mid-level exception to upgrade the roster. So as we got closer to the start of free agency, it was still kind of unclear what was going to go on with Klay. I think I kind of expected him to go back and they were going to give him a little more than what he ended up getting. But kind of seems like maybe they just didn't want him back. They just felt that it was time to move on. Apparently, there were no contract offers. And as we got closer to the start of free agency, it came out that he was going to leave. So no trade materialized for Chris Paul, so they just cut him outright. And with Klay Thompson departing, it was later announced that he was for sure going to leave. They now had effectively $31 million to spend on the roster. And I bring up that amount because that's the amount of space they have below the $178 million first apron. So if they're going to use the full mid-level exception or acquire players via sign and trade, they're going to be hard capped to that amount. And as we could see, they opened up that full mid-level exception. They opened the biannual as well. And they have this trade exception for Klay Thompson. The expectation was that they were going to just trade him to the Mavericks when it was just a 3-team deal without taking any money back. So this would have been the trade exception that they had. So then the Warriors went ahead and made their move. So the first thing they did was sign D'Anthony Melton with the entire non-taxpayer mid-level exception, that $12.8 million amount on a 1-year deal. So that's it. Now they are hard capped to that $178 million first apron. They cannot exceed it. So they are effectively now working within that $31 million budget that I just laid out. Then they went ahead and signed and traded for Kyle Anderson. They agreed to 3 years, $27 million. And that, when it was first reported, the idea was that he would probably go into the trade, Klay Thompson trade exception that they were going to generate from trading him to the Mavericks. But then it was reported that they were going to negotiate with Buddy Hield and sign and trade for him. And once it got finalized, it was pretty obvious that the deal was going to expand, and it became that big 6-teamer that went down. And because it was one big trade, they acquired both players simultaneously. Instead of signing and trading Klay Thompson first and then creating a trade exception to bring these guys in, they bring them both in at the same time, give them roughly the same first year salary, and they're able to give them both basically a combined $18 million, which is more than what the Klay Thompson trade exception would have been at just under $16 million. So then the roster is pretty much set. They're at 14 players. They could go into the season like this. And a couple things to note that, one, they are into the tax again, but they cannot pay that much because they're at the first apron. They're basically capped at paying this roughly $50 million amount since they can't further increase payroll from this level. And yeah, they're just 500,000 below the first apron, so they can't do anything else right now. They can't even sign their second round pick, Quentin Post. I think they're going to bring him in on a 2-way to start the season, but maybe they could trade. They could reduce some payroll through a trade later. As far as the overall offseason goes, so like I said, I like Klay Thompson to the Mavs. I think it's going to be a great opportunity for him. I also really like that he's no longer in Golden State. They tried to demote him last season, and it did not work out. And it's hard to do that after everything they went through. And understand, after all the success they had, it's really hard to have him be a role player on this team. And now he's gone, and they get to redistribute his usage to a lot of their younger guys and elevate them. They have a lot of good young players, in my opinion. Now they really get to play serious minutes and get more shots. So I think the Warriors are going to be better because of that. And generally speaking, just the players they got, these are just good players. They got Kyle Anderson, Buddy Hield, D'Anthony Melton. I really like all these guys. And I'm kind of surprised that the market was not very strong for role players like these. I think that aside from being good players, these are just great contracts, and they're going to age well. Especially, mainly, it's Hield and Anderson. They have more than 1 year on their deal. Those contracts are going to age really well as the cap set to go up 10% over the next few years. And I don't think the Warriors are done quite yet. They have a lot of guards right now, and even if they play much smaller than they hope, there's probably still going to be a pretty good guard that doesn't get to be in the rotation regularly. And we all hear the rumors. They're definitely trying to make a consolidation trade, which would make more sense of all of their roster build right now. They're trying to go after Lauri Markkanen. We'll see what happens there. And they could easily make the salaries match if that opportunity does become more serious. But otherwise, they could go into the season like this. And overall, I just think they have good depth. I think that they're going to be much better now. And with this team, I think they're addressing just the regular season. They haven't been able these past 2 years to consistently win enough games to be in the position they need to be. Especially last year, they just completely missed the playoffs. And I think that their depth, along with playing the youth more, I feel like they should get right back into the playoff mix. So, yeah, overall, I really like this offseason for the Warriors.